Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another session of the ACO Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Just before we go into today's session, I'd like to remind us all that this session is being held in English and French, and we ask that you choose your preferred language so that you follow the session very well. We'd also like to ask you that you put in your questions or need for clarification using the Q&A feature. Without wasting much time, I would like to invite Jim now to take over. Jim, are you online?
Yes, good morning, Blessing. How are you?
Well, thank you, Jim. How are you too?
I'm pretty good, thanks. Looking forward to an interesting discussion. So, good morning, everyone. Hello. It's good to be with you again, and thanks for joining us on our latest markets and marketing discussion. This morning, we're going to talk about, well, as usual, we're going to talk about the market. We're going to talk about market developments over the past couple of weeks, and then we're going to go on and talk about what I've called can't sell, won't sell, African processors and marketing. It's just a little article about how to market as an African processor and maybe some of the ways that this has been such a neglected aspect of business as the cashew sector in Africa has developed. Let me encourage you to join in, get involved. Good discussion is always positive. Any questions, add to the talking points, disagree, agree. You can use the chat or raise your hand if you're in Zoom. And you can also ask questions if you're following on Facebook Live or one of the other platforms. So let's get on with the market discussion. Let's start with kernels. So over the past 2 weeks since we were last with you, the restrictions have continued to ease in Vietnam. There's been a little bit of a sell-off from Vietnamese processors, and probably not the smallest of processors because most of them have been closed or inactive during the restrictions. And there has also been weaker September shipments, much as would be expected given the restrictions that were in place, but nonetheless still relatively positive shipments and exports of kernels from Vietnam. Looking at the freight situation, this has not gone away. You wouldn't expect it to have gone away by now. Perhaps the equipment aspect is easing. In China, they're manufacturing more containers more quickly than ever before, but the congestion continues. They're talking about, at least some of the agents and shipping lines are talking about this crisis going on to the end of next year. You will have seen, no doubt, on the news reports of ships queuing up outside US ports, particularly West Coast ports. And I was talking to a shipping line recently, and they were telling me now that the Asia, i.e. China or Vietnam, I suppose in our case particularly, to inland USA is now in or around 100 days. That means that a shipment that was made today would not arrive until the 28th of January, 2022. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. We look at demand and exports. Buyers seem to be being patient, particularly buyers in Europe and the United States for now. They've had pretty good levels of shipment over the past 2 to 3 months, indeed record levels. Those are coming in. Import figures remain steady. Buyers are patient, and well, who can blame them? The market's started to tip back down a little bit. Buyers don't like to buy in a market that's been falling. And they really are, at this time of year, in no particular rush. Although I think it's fair to say that there is still quite a large amount of buying to be done for next year. In the RCN markets, the big feature at the moment is the Tanzanian auction. In the general market, we've seen prices easing slowly. There's not been a great deal of business, I think, but prices have eased off a little bit. There's a gap between buyers and sellers. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Relatively slow start to the auction. On the 8th, it'll probably pick up. It always starts off a little bit slow. It always starts off at high prices. Let's see, and I'll come back to that one a little bit later. So let's try and put this in perspective. I'm going to do that by having a look at kernels prices. As always, I'm going to look at the prices of 3 grades, 320s, splits, white splits, fancy splits, whatever you're calling them, and large pieces or large white pieces. What I do is for large pieces, I take Vietnamese LPs as the benchmark. So if we look at the trend, we see that there has been a slight decline in price over the past, it's probably going on now about 3 weeks, maybe 3.5 weeks, where prices have drifted down a little bit. It seems to have stabilized over the past week or so, but there are still plenty of offers out there and not too many buyers chasing it. It's much more pronounced on 320s than it is on brokens. Broken prices remain relatively stable. That could be simply because a lack of stock built up, or it could also be that there just hasn't been any trade. If we look at the range of prices, there's nothing particularly new. The market has just eased back a little bit from the highs of the year, which we saw in September. So if we look at the situation now, we ask the question, well, why a sell-off after the restrictions? And it's not exactly easy to work that out. Some people suggest it's simply cash flow, it's moving stock on. Others suggest, and maybe I'm with these, that it's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, sell as it opens up again. And we did see this, don't forget, last year in Vietnam when COVID first appeared. We saw a kind of a rather panicky sell-off. The market hit $2.75, remarkably low, a great buying opportunity at that time. And the question now would be whether or not this is a great buying opportunity. As I say, it looks kind of stable at the moment. I don't think that there's particular interest amongst processors to knock prices down too much, particularly given the current prices for raw cashew nuts. Let's try and put that in a kind of a context, and let's try and first of all put it into a historical context. Where are these prices compared to where we've been in the past? So I took the 5-year, I always take 10-year, 5-year, 2-year high, low, and averages to try and engage the market. So I took the 5-year and I took the 2-year, and as you can see, compared to the 2-year average, the market today, which I'm putting down at 312 for 320s, and it's definitely higher for top processors, in some cases much higher, but it's also a little bit lower for some of the more aggressive sellers, some of the more aggressive processors in the market. So we're about 2% above the 2-year average, which isn't, it's about on par, let's say, but we're 15% below the 5-year average. Now, we need to adjust this because that period of March to May of 2020, when there was what I would call a kind of a panic in the market, particularly driven by Vietnamese processors selling off, market got knocked down to about $2.75, which was a 5-year low, 10-year low. The market, if we take that out, that March to May period of last year and recalculate the average price, you see the market around about parity. In fact, the market's on just about 10-year lows. So kernels look like pretty good value by any measure when we look at the current situation. So you can see our 2-year high is 345. We saw that in September. The 5-year high is a little bit of an anomaly at 520. But if we look at the 5-year average around 368, this market looks relatively attractive. There's nothing in prices at the moment that's going to damage demand. And if you really want to put a historical perspective on this, I was looking at it this week, and the first year I was trading cashews, which I'm going to tell you is 1985. That was my first year I was living in London trading cashews. The market hit $3.52 a pound. That's 36 years ago. So I don't think we can ever talk about cashew prices inflating. The 352 of 1985 was the 520 of 2017. Let's try and put that further in context, because we do need to take into account the freight and the additional cost of freight. So what I did was I had a look at the FOB prices and I just applied average freight rates over the period. So recalculated, we take the 5-year average cost and freight. So I just took cost and freight, European ports, Rotterdam, Hamburg, Felixstowe as an average, and we calculated 5 years, 2 years, and a quick calculation on the current situation. So even taking the incredible freight inflation that we've seen over the last 2 years, the market, which was 15% lower than the 5-year average, is still significantly lower. It's about 9% lower than the 5-year average. And if we compare it to the 2-year average, it goes from about 2% higher to about 6% higher. So even when we apply the huge increases in freight, you would still have to say that kernel's prices still look relatively attractive. But we have to also consider that these freight crises, it makes the delivery time longer. I mentioned 100 days from Asian ports to inland USA. It increases the cost of finance because the delivery time is longer. And of course, it eventually, and I think that's probably happened if we look at shipments in June and in July from Vietnam to the US and to Europe in particular, it increases inventory needs. So as we said over a year ago now, the COVID pandemic and the freight crisis that's happened at the same time, as partly as a result of that, has changed the way people buy. It's changed their inventory needs. It's changed their attitude to the system, to the just-in-time inventory system. And if you remember back in the spring, we had Wim Schipper from Intersnack with us, and he was explaining how more inventory was needed because voyage times are longer, and how Intersnack had adjusted to that. And we also had Wim during the ACA conference, if you remember. So kernel's prices drifting down, looking attractive, close to 2-year average FOB, a little bit above the 2-year average. If we add in the freight inflation, nothing in prices at the moment to either suggest that the market should be significantly lower, and nothing in the market to suggest that prices are going to make a significant move upward, other than to say that there's still a lot of buying to be done for next year. And maybe we should look at RCN to see clues of where the market will go. So looking at raw cashew nuts prices, we have seen in recent days, I wouldn't describe it as a sell-off, but it's more or less a standoff. What we've seen is we've seen prices start to drift down a little bit. Offers have got a little bit lower. We see processors naturally enough reluctant, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Imports continue quite strong. Vietnam's imports, these figures are very hard to work on this year. They're definitely distorted in some way. We all have our own ideas on how that's come about. But if we just compare September 21 with September 2020, we see a very strong import figure, about 50% up. If we look in India, by the end of August, which is the latest official figure, imports were up just under 5%, which means India needs about another 250,000 tons if they're going to match the 2020 figure, which was 873,000 tons. So again, if we look at RCN, certainly a little bit of a sell-off in the market. I would say inventories are probably at destination. Inventories, particularly in Vietnam, are higher than they've ever been. And there's no doubt that there is a little bit of a struggle going on between processors and raw nut sellers. And that will also have an impact on the Tanzanian auction as the weeks go on. So if we look at why that might be, So what I did was, now this is a rough guide. If you want a real analysis, we can talk about that too another time, but this is a rough guide. So we looked at current offered prices for Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzanian raw cashews on a cost and freight basis, and we compared it to a 320 price. So I took 315 in this case. And what you can clearly see that if we look at the average cost of kernels, so obviously you've got to apply grade outturn as well as actual outturn. So taking Ivorian around 48 pounds and Tanzanian around 50, 51 pounds at these offered prices, and they're offered prices, not traded prices, you can see that there is a significant gap between the price of RCN, if it were to be converted into kernels, and the actual market on kernels today. That's going to make life quite difficult for Vietnamese processors, or it means that RCN prices have to come down. Could kernels prices go up to meet that? Well, they could, of course, but only if buyers come back to the market. Now, we have seen a little bit of that in the last 2 days, but nothing that would suggest the market's going to pick up again back to that 340, 345 level. I would say one thing about kernels prices in West Africa, and to a certain extent, East Africa, the situation is a little bit different because we're looking at lower freight rates, faster transit times, processors that still have stocks of good quality cashew kernels of all grades are making significant premiums over the prices in Vietnam. And that's likely to continue. So right now we've got a situation where you have Vietnam lowest price, Africa, particularly West Africa, somewhere in between, and then India, as always, much higher price, but that's a domestic market. RCN prices in the short term would appear to be too high, at least the offered levels. And this is where this standoff is happening. Let's have a look at the crops. So I'll give you a quick update on how we're seeing the crops. There hasn't been a great deal of change. As you know, about 18 to 20% of the world crop comes in between October and January. We're now reaching the end of October. It's well underway. Tanzania, we're still talking about 260 to 280,000 tons as the estimate, although you would have to say on what's arrived so far, there'd be a question mark over the higher end of that figure, in my opinion. If we look in Brazil, no real change there. We're still looking at about 11% down on last year's crop. Mozambique, the estimate of crops in Mozambique is really a wide range. There's from trade sources, some of whom are as low as 85,000 tons, and official sources, some of whom are as high as 160,000 tons. Reality, of course, is somewhere in between. What I'd say over the last 2 weeks is that the lower end has moved up. The crop estimates and the reports are quite optimistic. So at this moment in time, on what we hear, we would expect that the Mozambique crop is going to be a better crop than last year and maybe a very good crop, but that's not clear just yet. So when we look at the situation around the Southern Hemisphere, we're seeing lower crop in Brazil, much better crop in Tanzania, good crop in Mozambique, normal to good crop in Indonesia is reported, leaving us around about a 10% increase. Doesn't really make a huge difference to the overall supply and demand on a global basis over the period between now, 20th of October, and March, April, when you start to get new crops. So you get Cambodian into Vietnam, the Vietnamese domestic crop coming around that time, a little bit of stock left in West Africa, but it's a relatively tight situation. Question marks would be how much is really in stock in Vietnam? What are the commitments of that stock in terms of kernel sales? And when will buyers of kernels come back to the market? I don't believe we're going to see huge volatility in raw cashew nut prices over the next 2 to 3 months, but certainly I would have thought that on what we know at the moment, that prices should start to drift down a little bit further, maybe start to trade around the current bid levels, which would be about $50 down. If we look closer at Tanzania, well, I've mentioned the crop estimate. We haven't really changed that. Let's look at what's come in. It's reported on the 15th of October that about 27,000 tons is in. That's cumulative. And about 17,000 tons of that has been sold. At the end of October last year, the report was just under 76,000 tons were in and 64,000 tons were sold. So that means for the second 2 weeks of October, you would hope that there'd be quite a big pickup in what's coming in Tanzania, and that could be sold at the auction. But that needs to be watched closely. If we look at auction prices, what we see is that prices have started. Certainly on the 8th and the 15th, prices started a little bit higher than the average of October last year. That's not altogether surprising. The market in each of the last 3 years has started a little bit higher and drifted down. As it drifts down, the volumes tend to pick up. So working out the reported auction sales price into a cost and freight cost basis, it comes out around $1,300 to $1,350. That is before traders' costs and margin. They've got to make a margin or this trade won't happen. Offers in the market, I hear around $1,550. I don't hear bids at those levels. Bids that I hear are more than $50 below that. Looks like a similar situation to last year in some ways. Last year it started around $1,575. You know, there's the usual kite flying, you might call it, early in the season. This year it started $1,650, then it was $1,600. People throw out prices to see if there's any bites. Last year it drifted down. It was somewhere between $1,440 and $1,470 cost and freight by the end of October. If it hits that level, it starts to make sense against kernels. And that could trade for the most efficient processors. For less efficient processors, perhaps not. Interesting point we should remember here is that shipments are limited to exports from Mtwara this year, and it's not altogether clear how that's going to work. One slightly confusing thing, and this is more from a longer term sector development in Tanzania. We saw some statements in the press during last week, politicians saying that everything will be sold through the auction. And this contradicts earlier advice, which I think is game-changing advice, that processors could buy direct from primary cooperatives. That's something which has been expected for a long time. And I'm presuming this is a little bit of bluster from a politician somewhere, but if it's not, that would be significant disincentive to processors in Tanzania. So that needs clarification. So as we look at it, I would say on what we know, the crop is a little bit later than expected. At least the intake of the crop is a little bit later than expected. Prices are slightly higher than we might have expected at the auction, but that's not surprising in that they tend to decline as October goes on and find their level during November. Let's have a look at demand for cashew kernels. If we look in Vietnam, we're seeing, as I said earlier, a little bit of a slowdown during August and September. So the red bars are the monthly 2021 and the light blue monthly 2020. So we look at September and we see it's about the same as last year. We look at August, about the same as last year. Cumulative, way ahead of any previous year. So very positive in that sense, but naturally, you get the restrictions, you're bound to see a slowdown. You get freight problems. At some point, you're bound to see a slowdown. If we have a look at imports into destinations, we take a look at the US and remarkable July and August figures. If you go back before we had the break in July, August from this GME, we were predicting that US imports would be very high during July and August based on shipments from Vietnam. And that's the case. I would expect that to slow down again because shipments have slowed down again. So one of the factors here is the long transit time. And the other factor is that probably US buyers ahead of the very busy season thought, let's make sure that we've got enough material in our warehouses. Who knows what will happen? And they were right. Look, in Europe, and this is the EU 27 plus the UK just combined into one figure. Similar figures, really, really remarkable August import figures up in all of the major countries. That followed on from July, which was relatively quiet, if you can say that, because European use of cashews, European imports of cashews are really moving up. Interest in this product in Europe, throughout Europe, is very high. Very positive figures. So what we'll expect is if we look again at Vietnamese shipments in August and in September, we would expect a little bit of a slowdown in US imports from September, October, and the same in the EU. Although, to emphasize again that a slowdown is within the midst of remarkable growth in demand. Demand is very strong, continues very strong. And it's interesting to note that the surge in demand experienced in 2020 has been maintained in 2021. So it wasn't just a function of lockdowns. There's more going on here, much more positive underlying trends than just those related to the pandemic. What about the biggest market in the world, India? Well, there's no doubt that with problems in the almond business, problems in volatility in different nuts, there's some problems in trade. I think that we could probably look or perhaps hope for some late, and it would be very late demand for Diwali, which is around the 4th of November. If we do see that, that will eventually translate into more buying of raw cashew nuts, probably in Tanzania, high quality raw nuts as Indian buyers start to restock for the months ahead. As I said earlier, if India is to match last year, they probably need about 250,000 tons. They could get a good proportion of that in Tanzania. High quality, good peeling characteristics, good shelling characteristics, attractive if the prices work. Overall, looking at demand, European imports, this is remarkable, really, up 22% in August compared to August last year, and a very strong underlying trend. In the United States, the July and August figures have really transformed the perspective on the year. So it's gone from about par. I think the US was up by about 0.2%. And the huge July and August figures means that today it's up by about 8% to the end of August. Now that may well moderate, and I'd be surprised if the US market imports were to finish at 8% up on the year, but it'll be interesting to see. And it's not surprising given the recovery or the catch up or the importing ahead of the freight and restrictions. It wouldn't be surprising to see the opposite happen toward the end of the year where it calms down again. And as you can see in the US, usually November and December are a little bit quieter than August, September, and October in terms of imports. Similar, last year in Europe, we saw October, November, December imports relatively calm, even compared to 2019. So this would explain the lack of prompt and spot buying at the origins, but we may well see some interesting trade for those who are carrying stocks in warehouses in Europe as the year goes on. So looking at October to December outlook, updating 2 weeks ago, we still think that RCN is likely to stay quite tight, even if prices do moderate a little bit. Last time we said that kernels could come under pressure. Well, kernels have come under pressure in terms of prices. It doesn't look as if there's any particular appetite to continue selling and dropping prices. If buyers come back, I would expect the market to start to move back up again. And as I say, I believe there is still quite a bit of buying to be done. Maybe not so much for the first quarter, but certainly for the second quarter of next year. Freight costs, well, we may see a stabilization in costs. I think we probably have seen a stabilization in 20-foot containers over the past 6 weeks or so, but the disruption will continue, and it doesn't look like prices are going to come down anytime soon. It's interesting, actually, if you look at the stock market predictions, and sometimes stock market analysts can give us some good clues, and they're predicting continued very high profitability for anyone related to shipping lines, shipping agencies for the rest of 2021 and 2022. And if they're right, that's probably an indication that these high freight rates and the disruption associated will continue well into next year. The Tanzanian auction, looking at it, I think it's waiting for Indian buyers. I may or may not be right on that. I'm not 100% convinced, but I don't believe that we're going to see aggressive buying from Vietnam, except in a case perhaps if auction prices were to drop away sharply. But for the moment, there's no reason for that to happen. So Indian demand might well be the clue to the next move in the Tanzanian auction. I think if we look at demand-wise, we've seen demand is strong. We've seen Europe, United States, all very strong in terms of demand. We see China this year also strong, although it's been quiet. October is a big holiday month in China. The market has been quiet lately. Shipments from Vietnam have probably dropped back a little bit, but this is a year where Chinese demand for cashew nuts has broken all previous records. So I think buyers, European buyers, American buyers will take their time coming to the market. They will be back, but they may take their time to do so and observe the market over the next few weeks. Probably with one caveat or one disclaimer on that is that West African fast transit, 2-3 weeks transit containers into Europe could continue to be in strong demand. There may not be that much stock left, and some buyers will need to fill in some of their orders. You're always going to see that when you've got A, freight disruption, and B, strong growth in demand. So we're expecting to see continued opportunities for African processors. It's about having your operation organized and in the right place. But this is definitely the right time if you're an African processor. That's the market. Hasn't changed a great deal over the last 2 weeks. Still a lot of disruption. And I think we shouldn't discount COVID-19. This can come back. We know that there are repeated waves of COVID-19. If it appears strongly in any country at any time, we could see restrictions, even lockdowns shouldn't be ruled out. Lockdowns are tending to disrupt the supply chain rather than to restrict supply. They're tending, when they happen, to boost demand rather than to restrict it, perhaps except for India. But for now, I would say the year looks like coming to a relatively positive end. Prices relatively stable, demand strong. Still a lot of problems on freight, and I guess a lot of buyers and supply chain managers in the kernels business have their head down trying to make sure they've got enough product in place to finish off this year strongly. So coming to our second subject today, I want to talk to you a little bit about marketing. I just call this Can't Sell, Won't Sell, and I'll tell you why. Because recently a new entrant into cashew processing in Africa, an investor from a strong food business background, asked me about the best way to sell cashews. And he said he wanted to figure it out before they started processing. And I realized I'd worked with a lot of cashew processors in Africa, but there were only two that I would describe as being good at marketing. There are only two that I would describe as living up to the standards that you would expect for a positive marketing process. It's often a very neglected aspect of investment and development in the cashew sector. And as you probably know, there are many projects to develop growing, many projects for technical assistance in processing, for the supply of equipment, understanding the supply chain, but very few that focus on the basic skills and needs to market cashew kernels. Maybe because worldwide cashew kernels have tended to market themselves when we see such positive demand trends. So I thought I'd have a look at this. And this is based on, we do a training for exporters generally, cashew processors is my favorite if it happens, but generally for exporters in developing countries on markets and marketing. So we focus on a couple of issues to start with. So first of all, build and they will come is not a plan. Too many people actually neglect marketing. They build a factory, they know there's good demand, and they hope the buyers will turn up. And if we look at the market and buyers generally, many buyers simply don't know the opportunity to source cashews in Africa. Many don't trust the African cashew sector to do the job well. Many don't believe that cashew processing in Africa can be competitive. And worse, some, they don't know that they don't know. So they're not even aware that there is an option, there's a possibility for processing at origin. And the reason for that, to my mind, is that simply, one, we don't listen to buyers in the African cashew sector. And two, we don't tell them what's going on in processing, or we don't tell them enough, or we don't tell them efficiently. We don't sell. So this is where we get to a position where until probably the middle of last year, many buyers, maybe most buyers, thought that African cashews should be cheaper than Vietnamese cashews and would often make offers to processors on the basis that they would offer a discount against Vietnamese cashew kernels. It's not surprising that they'd come to that conclusion, but when you wonder, what can we do about that? And the answer is in better marketing. So build and they will come is not a plan. Secondly, help me out is not a plan. The idea that I need someone to buy my products, come and help me out because I've made a bit of a mess of my home marketing or my inventory here. And as we know, the cashew business is complex. And as we know, there are so many different studies and reports on how this business works or how it should be regulated or how it should be processed or how it should be grown. And very little on selling, very little on how to market. So processors need a sales plan. And I'm really here talking to African cashew processors and the organizations that support them. What any business needs is a sales marketing plan. And the way I look at it is that you break that up into manageable stages. So this is a synopsis of a much longer coaching course, which is designed for developing country exporters in the food business. Step one is listen. The old saying, you've two ears and one mouth. Use them proportionately. Listen, market research, listen to what customers are saying. Secondly, work out what you want to achieve. Market access. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And then you move on to actually doing business. Market entry, market communication, and delivery. So when we look at listening, market research, how does the market work? Are our preconceptions about the market real? And this is, for me, a big problem. You see so many people with preconceptions about the market. The European market is not accessible. It's too dear. The American market is too low in price. Not necessarily true. And finally, we have to look at what do buyers want. And once we know those things, then we have to work out what do we want to achieve? What products do we want to export? Well, cashews, obviously. What is it? Bulk? Is it bulk? Is there an opportunity for consumer products? What about the export of byproducts? What volume do we want to export? What's the target market? What kind of a customer are we looking for? So this involves an honest self-appraisal, looking at our business and deciding what do we need in terms of marketing and what do we need in terms of customers. And it's not just, and this is always an issue, it's not just about finding a customer. It's about finding the right customer for your business. We often see this case, you know, we have a customer, we sold 1 or 2 containers last year, we haven't heard from him again. What's going on? We never heard any report on the product or any problem. We haven't done any business. It normally means that the wrong customer has been selected. Then you come to market access. What do we need to change or develop in the business to realize that it might be food safety, it might be some form of change to the process, it might be, most importantly, about communication. And I think in reality, this is a big area of weakness. So first of all, we have to talk about what's our strategy to enter the market, but then how do we communicate? How do we communicate our strategy? How do we communicate our business? And finally, to build relationships for the long term. So within that framework of a sales marketing plan, we have to start by, as I said, listening. And this is probably important for the entire sector, in my opinion. And we have to look at what are the problems that buyers of kernels face. And the biggest problem that they find is finding qualified suppliers. A qualified supplier is a supplier that can meet their requirements, not only in terms of quality, but also food safety, reliability, and all of the other aspects. Buyers have the problem of high dependence on a single origin. US dependence on Vietnam is running at about 89% this year. Europe is around 80. And we see what happens when that gets disrupted. And the pandemic has been a further warning to buyers of kernels that high dependence on a single origin has risks. They face the risk of very long chains, not only 100 days to now from Asia to inland USA, but before that, 80% of the raw material processed in Vietnam has to travel from West Africa. And before it gets to the ports in West Africa, it has to travel down the roads, cross borders to get shipped. It's a long transit, and the longer the chain, the greater the risk. Buyers faced the need for transparency and for traceability, which they can't get in the current RCN chain, or it's very difficult to get in the current RCN chain. So if you're buying, I think it was 84% of Vietnamese raw cashew nuts were imported last year. Apart from those from Cambodia, it's nearly impossible to work out a full traceability program on the rest. Buyers are looking for shorter supply chains, nearer supply chains, and they're looking for agile supply chains to withstand the shocks. Earlier, I mentioned about changes in inventory levels. And I mentioned about changes in the method of organizing businesses, changes to the just-in-time system. All of these things are not only part of the pandemic, but they're also part of the fact that most buyers have a high dependence on one origin. And that's a difficulty, particularly when the products that's exported and processed in that origin is not grown there. Second step, still listening, still doing market research, is to have a look at actually what do buyers want. And when we look at the cashew business, we see that there's certain legislative requirements in Europe, now in the United States under the Food Safety Modernization Act. There's the basics of product quality, product packaging, certainly a competitive price, but also reliability, contract fidelity, traceability, and quality management or food safety systems. So buyers' needs are complex. Some of them are negotiable, others aren't. But what we are seeing is when we look at Europe, probably the leader in food safety legislation. So we look at Europe, the UK, high levels of food safety requirements. We look at North America, particularly the US, where the Food Safety Modernization Act has changed that relationship between the user of the cashews and the processor. And we look at this ever expanding RCN chain. It's a complex relationship. And over the past 2 years, it's been relatively volatile relationship, not so much in price, but in terms of all the other aspects, supplies of product, supplies of packaging materials, voyage times, contract fidelity, traceability, all these are major issues. So we look at those two things and we talk about what do buyers want and what problems do they face. Step 3, let's look inside a little bit and start to think about what problems can African processors solve. Well, first of all, certainly African processors can supply fresh, quality food safe cashew kernels. And fresh is first for a reason, because most of the cashews in the world, by the time we consumers end up buying them in a supermarket or a convenience store, are pretty old. They're by no means fresh. And if you've ever tasted a really freshly roasted cashew and compared it to a product that you would buy in a European supermarket, you notice a huge difference. Secondly, African processors can offer a sustainable supply chain. And this is for the long term. Production has been increasing in Africa. It's likely to go through another spurt of growth over the next 10 years. African processors are the only processors that, for all of their material, can offer traceability. And traceability is a risk mitigation or a risk management tool that can only be done in Africa at the moment, apart from the Vietnamese domestic crop and whatever small exports India is making. Indian exports continue to fall this year, as you may have seen. As the last 6 months have shown, African processors can offer faster, lower cost delivery. Freight is lower, shipping times are shorter. That's why some buyers were prepared to pay premiums to qualified African processors. And I'm going back to that qualified. The opportunity is only open to those that are qualified. That means food safety, that means good management. It also means good marketing. Going on, looking at the problems. Origin processed products, this is important. This is a basis for a big change in the food industry. African processors can offer supply chain certification. So it's much easier to develop, for example, take organic, and I use the USDA logo, but take organic certification. You can do that if you're close to the supply chain, much more easily than if you're importing material from 7,500 kilometers away, where you've never met the farmer, never even met the man who buys from the farmer. You've never even met the man who buys from 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 the farmer. So how can you certify it? Well, you can't, is the answer. African processors offer an alternative option to Vietnam, not a replacement, an alternative to Vietnam. And finally, and I think maybe one of the most interesting aspects is that if you buy from an African cashew processor, there's an opportunity to be part of that story. because the processor is linked to the supply chain, to the growers, to the intermediaries. To be part of that story, to make a difference, and possibly to build that story into the profile of the end consumer products. And if you want examples of that, look at the marketing of coffee. Look at what's been happening in cocoa. If you want something a little bit closer to home, you can have a look at the way American filberts, walnuts are marketed, often connected back to the story of the farmer. So being part of the story can be very strong. And sometimes as exporters, we fail to tell the story. So when we look at what problems can African processors solve, let's look at the steps involved in solving those processes. And that's what they call market access. And the first aspect is, well, what product do we want to export? Is it a consumer pack? Is it a bulk pack? And which market do we want to export it to? There are options out there. There's a lot of different markets in the world. What market do we want to sell to? So it's not a case of see who happens to be passing and might buy some cashews from us. It's a case of where do we want to go? What do we want to sell? And which market do we want to sell to? The next step is what kind of customer? What's the relationship with the customer? We talk about communicating quality as a way of life. So quality is a marketing opportunity. The cashew kernels are the same cashew kernels. If you can present them as food safe, you will get buy-in from buyers. Buyers aren't aware of this at the moment. So what kind of customers do we want to sell to, and what message do we tell them? And the message we tell them, we gain that by listening to what they need. And finally, in terms of market access, we talk about identifying your competitive advantages, realizing that value is not just money, price isn't everything, and looking at buyers' requirements, what's negotiable. You can't negotiate on the law in the destination country, but maybe you can negotiate on other aspects. But the basic thing I would always say is that the quality of the product and the food safety aspects for African processors, because they're going to be focused on Europe and North America, that these are the things that open up the opportunity. And building that trust is an essential element. And the best way to build trust is to interact, tell your story, change your business so that it matches what the customers that you've selected want to work with you. There's always risk, but there are certain aspects that can make buyers feel a little bit more comfortable with supplier risk. So just a few things. Recommendation from other buyers, a food safety system and certification. HACCP is a great starting point. From HACCP, you can build an ISO or an FSSC and move on from there. Product sheets and quality records. So keeping records of the quality that's going through the factory, of the shipments, asking customers what they thought of the product, asking them for any complaints. So you tend to hear from customers when there's complaints, and you tend not to hear from them when everything goes well. So you've got to ask them when it goes well so that they'll tell you what they think of the product. And all of this involves good communication habits. So good professional communication habits make a buyer feel more comfortable. Knowledge of the market is helpful. And of course, reliability, which can all be shown off in a good professional website. And if you look at some of the African cashew processors, even good processors, don't have websites. And they should, because it is an opportunity to demonstrate all of these things above. What makes their buyers feel more comfortable with supplier risk. And of course, that's at the beginning, but as the relationship develops, they get more and more comfortable with their supplier. Communication is absolutely essential. Reliable importers need to communicate. They need to be active. They need to be found. And this needs a development of active research and sales promotion, good communication, online presence, whether it's social media or a website, always asking for feedback on product, building networks through African Cashew Alliance, for example, meetings and seminars, collecting information, using information, giving a little to gain a lot. And all of this built in a framework of what they call CRM, or customer relationship management. So it is essential to sell. It's essential to market, and it's essential to have a plan around that. In summary, processors who maybe today can't sell can change that by good preparation and research, by good planning, by working on communication skills, as well as communication methods, by being active on social media, by having facts and figures to hand, by understanding the market and being able to talk about the market. And of course, following all of that up with good communication, always building on shipments, sales, things like trade shows, so that you start to build your network and you build your profile. And I'll leave you on this aspect with two particular factors for cashew processors. Never ever make promises that you know you cannot fulfill. The old saying is, expectation is the root of all heartbreak. Don't build up an expectation that you can't meet, or you'll lose your buyer. And secondly, never hide from a problem. Long ago, I learned that if you've got a late shipment or a problem with a shipment, the conversation before the problem has happened is so much easier than the conversation after it's happened. So if you've contracted to ship in October, telling someone 3 weeks before, look, we have a problem, this is not going to go out in time, is a much different conversation to 2 weeks into November, when the buyer calls and says, where's my shipment? Oh, yeah, I meant to tell you about that. So never ever hide from a problem. So I think sales and marketing is a sadly neglected aspect of the cashew business in Africa. That's not to say there aren't some outstanding examples, but I would like to say, in general, we need to give this more attention, and we need to work on this aspect of business. Well, thanks very much indeed for listening this morning. I hope you've found that interesting, maybe food for thought. And if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Jim. And I have a few questions here which I would be posing. Maybe the first one, before we go to the ones that are already in the chat, we have received some, and I'll just be asking the questions. Someone said, you mentioned that we observe many offers and few buyers, but beyond cashews, are there issues of falling consumptions? That's the first question.
No, there's no issue of falling consumption. The import figures that we've looked at show that. You know, you certainly might see the situation where imports at the end of the year are a little bit calmer than in the beginning of the year, but all the figures tell us that demand for cashews is really strong.
Okay. The second question is about destinations inventory being higher, especially in Vietnam. What of inventory of kernel in US and Europe?
Well, I think inventories are probably quite high at the moment because we've seen 2 months of high imports, but they will be worked through in the coming months and probably have already been worked through to a certain extent. So I wouldn't say that we're looking at a surplus situation, and I wouldn't be at all concerned that there is over inventory, but probably the import situation as at the end of August, if we look at the trend, that will probably settle down. It probably looks a lot stronger at the end of August than it will at the end of December. I suspect by the time we get to the end of December, we'll have a year that's roughly similar to last year.
Okay, before I continue with the questions that are coming in on my phone, we have Amit asking if you could elaborate on the viability slide you presented for Vietnam.
On the viability?
Yeah, the viability slide on Vietnam.
Okay, well, I mean, what I'm saying is that the price of RCN calculated at the moment doesn't equate to the current price of kernels. And that price, either the price of kernels must go up or the price of RCN must come down. And in the absence of buyers, it suggests that RCN may drift down a little bit. I'm not talking about huge volatility here, but if it's to come into line. Now, we should also bear in mind that there have been many, many periods when RCN prices and kernels have been out of kilter, and that, for example, RCN has been higher than the equivalent kernels market, and very occasionally the opposite. So it can persist for a long time. That's true. But eventually it has to come into line.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Dear participants, just so you know, we are answering all your questions and concerns, and if you have any, please drop it in the Q&A chat box. Thank you. We have some questions here already, which says, how does inflation factor in the 10-year numbers? If it's excluded, will be at an even lower 10-year price.
Well, inflation, at least in Western economies, has been very low over the past 10 years. It is not factored into the price. I mean, if it were, cast your mind back to the story I mentioned of 1985 when 320s traded at $3.52. So inflation, it's a fair point that if you were to factor inflation into the last 10 years, the price would be even more attractive or lower. But we'd also then have to look at, we could get really complicated on this. You'd have to then look at the index of food prices also in the period. There's a couple of points there. I agree that if we were to factor in inflation over 10 years, that cashew prices today would look more attractive. Number one. Number two, I think that it's probably likely that we're looking at an emerging period of higher food prices in general, which will make nuts generally and cashews especially look more attractive to consumers in all markets.
Okay. Another question here is, you talked about a good business plan as a means of having better access to the markets. What aspects should be elaborated in the business plan? And as most processors have it, but still with no success. So what aspect should be elaborated in the business plan?
Well, I'd break it down into those areas. First of all, good market research so that you understand the market before you start to write a business plan. And secondly, that a good business plan needs a good, honest self-appraisal of the business. I mean, being realistic, this is who we are, this is what we're capable of, these are our problems, and then match the two things together, the research and the self-appraisal, to come to a conclusion of this is our ambition, this is where we want to go. And what I find is one of the biggest aspects that's missing in marketing plans that I've seen is that exporters tend to focus on just finding a buyer rather than trying to focus on what kind of a buyer suits them best so that they go looking for the right kind of buyer. You look for a buyer who only buys whole grades, you're going to eventually end up with a problem of a lot of brokens in your warehouse, which might sound familiar to a number of people. So I think that this aspect of honest self-appraisal and then a plan to what kind of customer, research the customer, start to build the relationships, and think about communication. A lot of things go wrong due to poor communication. So it's important to put those things in place. So the business plan should focus on the marketing aspects. And I was talking today mostly about a sales and marketing plan, but a business plan should also have the technical aspects in terms of we've identified what buyers want, what kind of food safety certification is acceptable, packaging, payment terms, all of those aspects. So it's a long list for that business plan, but I'll just focus on the bits that I think sometimes are missing. And that's the honest self-appraisal of the business, almost like an internal export audit, if you like, on the one hand. And secondly, the communication, developing the right kind of communication so that your message gets across to your buyer. We've a whole set of tools actually that we've evolved over the last 10 years or so to do those kind of things. It can be a difficult process, but it need not be hugely complex. Sometimes the most difficult thing is getting different parts of an organization to honestly talk to each other about what they need and what they're capable of doing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have another question here. You mentioned prices for W320 from 30 years ago is similar to what it is today in US dollar terms. If that is the case, considering inflation, isn't USA buying at cheaper than 30 years ago? And in that case, the buyers take the processors for a ride at massive cost to the processing nation, that too.
Wow, yeah. Let's not turn an anecdote into the market history, first of all. But yeah, I mean, I do not think that that's the case, because I think that the price of the cashew kernels in the stores over the years has not changed, or maybe is even cheaper than it was all those years ago. Bear in mind, at that time, cashews were pretty elite products, generally bought by older middle-class people, very expensive. Today, that complete profile has changed. I don't believe that the margins that roasters or distributors make would in any way indicate that they've been taking processors for a ride. Maybe occasionally processors, I don't know how would you say it? Maybe they take themselves for a ride by dropping prices without need. You do see that from time to time. We saw it in 2020.
Okay, we have a question also here saying, according to your analysis of the market, do you think we will have a stable cost of RCN for the coming season?
By the coming season, I presume you're looking at 2022. Well, the first thing 2022 is we will only know when we realize how the crops are faring. Let's assume that we've got good crops coming. So what would you see is probably a pretty healthy position at destination in terms of inventories as we end the 21-22 season coming into 2022. I don't think that there is looking at kernels prices, I don't think there's a lot of room for a fall in kernels prices. You would expect over the next year or 2 years, slightly firmer prices than we've got now, hopefully relatively stable prices. And before the pandemic happened, we were looking at cashew kernels 320s. Expectations were that prices would settle around $3.40. That didn't happen because of the pandemic. That was February, March 2020. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw them return to that kind of a level. There's no real indication of any problems with crops for next year, but of course it's very early. What we do expect is that Cambodian production, which is not as high as some people think, but that it will continue to increase. We do think that there are good crops coming in East Africa. So on that basis, I think that there's no reason to believe that we're going to see a particularly volatile situation next year. But probably kernels are a little bit too low right now, and probably RCN is a little bit too high by my analysis.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have another question here. Taking a long-term perspective, do you see West African processors eventually being able to compete with the likes of Brazil to supply East Coast USA?
Well, I don't see why not. I mean, some are doing it now. I mean, things have changed. The advent of good equipment, the availability or greater availability of better managers, some really interesting success stories in Cote d'Ivoire, in Benin, smaller ones elsewhere, indicate to me that yes, the job can be done. All the trends in the market, if we look at the sustainability, the threats from climate change, all of those trends, and the trends then at consumer level, origin-based processing, natural foods, fresh foods, healthy foods, all of those trends in the market tend to point toward origin processing. Now, there are probably certain factors, cost of utilities, for example, that are very difficult to address. But it should be that West African processors have a cost advantage because their raw material moves maybe a few hundred kilometers. It doesn't move thousands of kilometers. So that advantage should be able to tackle the higher costs. Big issue, I think, right now is the availability of inventory financing and working capital for processors. That is an issue. If that were to ease somewhat, or if we were to get different kinds of investors who had access, there's no reason, to my mind, why African processors cannot compete in the US market. They can certainly compete with Brazilian processors. The real standard in terms of cost is in Vietnam. And between the cost of moving the raw material and improved management of processes in West Africa, yes, I think it can be done. And I think buyers want that to be done. And that's becoming more and more apparent in the last 2 years than ever before.
Thank you very much, Jim. Just as a follow-up to this very answer to the question, also talking about being competitive, African processors being competitive. You were recently in a trade show. Are there experiences that you picked that you think may be useful to the African processors?
Yeah, I was at Anuga.
Yeah,
A very unusual Anuga. A much lower number of visitors than normal, which was great because people had time to talk. Big lessons for me were, number one, the interest in nuts, and not just cashew nuts, but the interest in almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts. The whole range is enormous. I talked to people from the US who are on both sides of the fence, buying and selling. I looked at the way that Californian walnuts and almonds are marketed. I looked at the way that Oregon hazelnuts are marketed. And it made me think really that professional marketing, presenting the benefits of the product, is really important. But the main takeaway was that you walked around the fair, and I was with a group of exporters, not cashew guys, but a group of exporters of another range of tree nuts. I walked around the fair with them, and what we found is wherever we went, that those stands that were engaged in the nuts business were really busy, even when some of the stands around them were fairly quiet. So very positive outlook in terms of demand and trends. Some positive outlook in terms of innovation. We saw some very interesting use of cashew nuts. We saw a product manufactured in Slovenia, which uses snack cashews in dips, in different flavors. Beautiful presentation of the product, very interesting. We saw, I suppose, and maybe that was another factor. I saw some interesting buying signals or more interest from Eastern Europe. So perhaps consumption in that region is picking up on cashews too. And if you looked at the general trends, healthy, natural, sustainable, both socially and environmentally sustainable, these were huge factors. There weren't a lot of cashew people there due to the pandemic, of course. And those that were there were mostly on the marketing and sales side. My takeaway was very positive message. Demand looks set to continue to grow, but we do need to be very, very attentive to aspects such as food safety, sustainability, good marketing, what I like to call good storytelling.
Thank you very much, Jim. Okay, I'm just checking to see if we have, okay, we have a reaction on the inflation, and 2% of inflation compounded over 10 years adds up to 22%. That is about 60 cents per ton. So WW330 at $3 in 2020 should be $3.66 just to keep up with inflation. If in nominal terms, the price has remained the same, then current prices are a really good deal. That is probably the result of mechanization and increased efficiency in processing. This is a reaction to your earlier answer.
Yeah, but inflation wasn't 2% for the last 10 years. So, we have to be careful when we make these assumptions. So the point is valid, but the fact is inflation wasn't 2%. Having said that, I don't think anyone would dispute that cashew prices are attractive. Definitely prices are attractive and interesting, any way you want to measure it. And bear in mind that the price of cashews has never really been a huge barrier for long-term development in the market. What's been a big problem for most buyers, and indeed most importers, I think, and probably many processors, is the volatility of prices. If you do a trend analysis on the increase in demand expressed as imports, the fastest growth in demand in the last 20 years was in the period from 2012, end of 2012 to 2015, which was a period of stable prices. Prices weren't particularly low, but they were stable. And that was also a period when there were a lot of different developments and applications for brokens were worked on. If you get a period like 2017, when we saw prices move up, over $5 a pound for 320s, that's really off-putting for buyers. It's really off-putting for innovators to use the product, to do something new with it. So I think the price for me is not an issue. It's not in dispute that current prices are attractive. What's an issue is price stability, particularly the price volatility that doesn't seem to have any particular logic.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question here. How does the rising price of oil, CNSL, more than $80 per barrel impact cashew kernel prices? Since processors with CNSL plants can now gain substantially more on CNSL, would they be willing to accept lower kernel prices than before? Would that also explain a lower gap between RCN and kernel prices?
No, because CNSL isn't enough of a contributor to the overall revenue of the business to have that impact. And if you think about $80 a ton on CNSL, you equate that back to kernels, you would be looking at a very small increase in kernels. So I don't think it will have any major factor, but I do think it's a very interesting point, because what it brings to mind is that we need to exploit the byproducts in the most effective fashion. Cashew nut shell liquid is a valuable product, and it can be used for a lot of applications, replacing manufactured ingredients with natural ingredients, for example, in various processes. And we should look at exploiting the byproducts, particularly in African countries where it's not being done at the moment, but we should look at exploiting it for high value applications rather than low value applications, like, for example, just burning it. This to my mind is questionable, because it forgoes a huge opportunity to manufacture interesting, natural, high-value products.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm just checking on other platforms, because we are live on Facebook and YouTube, to see if we have any more questions. Dear participants, we have exhausted all the questions that you posed. If anybody wants to answer or ask any question directly to Jim, kindly use the raise hand feature, and then we'll call you in to ask your question. We have exhausted all the questions in the Q&A chat. Maybe, Jim, we can just give them a few seconds, and if nobody asks any question, you can then give your final words before we call it a day. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your question if you have any. And if you would like to ask your question directly to Jim, you may raise your hand. There's a feature below on your screen. You may raise your hand and then you'll be called in to ask the question. Okay, I think that's just about it. Jim, just before we come to the end of the session, do you have any final words?
I would just like to reiterate for any processors or interested processors or investors listening, don't neglect the importance of marketing. There's many, many different things in a project. History is telling us that marketing has been one of those that's been neglected, and it's something we need to know. And I think ACA can help with that. And there are other organizations that can do so. Next time, we're going to talk about, again, markets, of course, and we'll have a look at the East African crops. And hopefully we might have one or two guests with us that'll tell us some more about business in cashews in Tanzania, Mozambique, and possibly in Kenya too. Thank you all very much indeed for your interest today. It's great to be with you, and I look forward to the next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jim. And dear participants, just so you know, the next session, Jim will be with us, will be on the 3rd of November. Please schedule and mark your calendars. The 3rd of November, we are here again live with you. Before we go, we'd like to acknowledge all our partners and sponsors who have made this session possible, and the likes of Cashew Info, Com Cashew, CNF Pro Cashew, TechnoSurf, Benin Cashew, SNI, and Intersnacks. And of course, to you, our participants, for joining us every 2 weeks as we bring to you Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The next session, I repeat, will be on the 3rd of November, and we ask that you join us again. But until then, please do stay safe. Bye-bye.
What do you care most when buying color sorters? What makes better sorting performance? What ensures high stability and reliability regardless of 1 unit or 10,000 units? Quality is all.